This is a special presentation of Viewpoint. Ahead of the general election, a look at the second highest voting population, Latinos. This is Idaho's Voto Latino.
Thanks for joining us for this special edition of Viewpoint. I'm Joe Paris. We're just a few weeks away from the general election, and a mix of national and local issues are on the ballot. According to the Secretary of State's office, during the 2020 general election, more than 81% of registered voters voted. But during the 2022 midterm elections, just over 57% of Idahoans who were registered to vote actually went to the polls to cast their vote. And data across the country shows that Hispanics are the second largest group of voting age Americans and play an important role in the national elections. Our Brenda Rodriguez joins us now with a look at why that's also true on the local level.
Joe, voter data is hard to track when we're talking about race and ethnicity, and that's because when you go and cast your vote on the ballot, it does not require that information. We wanted to get a glimpse of what Idaho's Hispanic community looks like, and we have data coming from the census, the 2020 census, and the Idaho Commission on Hispanic Affairs' most recent data. And what we found was that 13% of Idaho's population are Hispanic, living in all 44 counties, and the most Hispanic residents reside over in Canyon County. They have over 62,500 residents, but only make up 25% of that population. It's still a pretty small percentage there. The highest percentage of Hispanics in Idaho are in Clark County, making up 41% of that population. Clark County is the only county required on a federal level to provide translated materials on the ballot. We'll talk about that as we get through this special. But 70% of Hispanics living here in Idaho are U.S. citizens, live old enough to vote. And when we look at the midterm elections in 2022, we saw an 11.1% voter turnout, specifically being Latinos. And if we compare that to the previous election, there was a 2% decrease of voter turnout. This is going to become very important as we get through the show here. We'll come back to this in just a second. But Idaho's congressional districts are made up of two. District number 1, the population there, 10% of that population are Hispanic. District number 2, 13% of that population are Hispanic. And as this community continues to grow, Idaho Commission on Hispanic Affairs Executive Director says that that's not being translated to voters and people actually making it to the polls. And that's partly due because of these disparities here that people face here in Idaho. That includes language barrier, lack of resources, and education.
It's one thing to get them registered to vote, but we need to get them to the polls to vote.
Why can't we get our Latinos, everyone, to the polls?
You know, Brenda, I think that we're lacking a lot of education. We're lacking an organization that will work towards helping our families understand the meaning behind why it's important that they vote.
Do we know what counties are up top when it comes to Latino voters?
I think Canyon has really shown their numbers pretty high. Canyon County, the Magic Valley also has pretty good numbers. They're fairly low up in Bonneville. Idaho is far behind in collecting data based by ethnicity. So it's really hard for us to really get a good picture. I also see, because of that population of ours, of the Hispanic population being strongest at 25 years and younger, there is going to be a climate change here in Idaho.
Why do you think that is?
Not that we don't have elderly, but we, as we mentioned earlier, in the census, they're not, for example, they're probably not being counted.
For the young Latino voters watching right now, would you like to send them a message?
You have not only do you have the rights, but you have the responsibility. Carry that voice forward, because we all owe it to our ancestors who have worked very hard and continue to work hard for this state.
Joe Gonzalez says that it's important to track data like race and ethnicity, because then you can pinpoint the communities that are not showing up to the poll and maybe provide a little bit more resources to that community to actually get them to vote.
Crucial information for our communities. Brenda Rodriguez, thank you so much. Well, something that's often said before elections, this is the most important election ever. And as Brenda mentioned, while Latinos are the fastest growing minority group in Idaho and across the United States, a lot of them still are not showing up to vote. So why is that? Our Hector Mendoza takes a deep dive.
The right to vote is the most protected constitutional right that we have than any other constitutional right under the U.S. Constitution and the state constitution as well.
Leo Morales, the executive director for the ACLU, says Latinos face many roadblocks heading to the polls and getting access to resources.
We've got individuals that are naturalized citizens. We've got individuals that were born here, and so they have birthright citizenship. We also have, in this country, I would say, multiple systems that sometimes discourage individuals from participating in our democracy.
A new report by the Brennan Center, a nonpartisan law and policy institution, says nearly 100 laws that make voting more difficult have been enacted in 29 states, including Idaho.
For example, we have voter ID laws, right? That actually has a disproportionate impact on certain population. It has a disproportionate impact on the elderly, low income, and individuals whose English is not the first language as well.
In addition to Idaho's voter ID law that limits which IDs are acceptable to vote, another example includes HB 599 that aims to prevent ballot harvesting. The bill makes it a crime for certain people to collect or deliver another voter's mail-in ballot. The Brennan report also says the Latino voter turnout was 22% less than the rate of white voters during the last presidential election.
The resources have not been there.
Another barrier some Latino voters face is language. Spanish-speaking voters aren't always able to make an informed decision with limited access to Spanish language content. The Secretary of State has a voter guide in Spanish on their website, but once you get to the polls, ballots are only in English, with the exception of Clark County in eastern Idaho. That's due to the Federal Voting Rights Act, which requires a state or county to provide language help if more than 5% of voters in that jurisdiction have limited English skills.
The Treasure Valley doesn't meet that criteria.
Morales says there is also very limited access to translators at the polling locations.
There is a right for individuals to be able to take an interpreter or someone that can help them to the voting booth.
That could be a friend or a family member.
No question, the language barrier presents a very big challenge for many of our Idaho friends and neighbors. And I think that's one of those last pieces to discuss on how to do that, because not everyone's going to have a son or a daughter or a relative that maybe can take them.
Debbie Critchfield is the superintendent for the Idaho State Board of Education. She speaks some Spanish, but knows candidates need to do more to reach Latino communities.
I don't like that I'm going to say this to you, but I think sometimes we have folks that get overlooked. Not because it was intentional. We got put into place to represent the people who sent us there. And if we're not paying attention to parts of our state, we're not fully doing our jobs. And if that means I'm not able to fully communicate with someone, then I probably need to find others who can help facilitate that.
Do you have Latinos or people that speak Spanish on your team or people around you like that? Or?
No, and so as I'm saying this, I'm like, I need to do better myself.
It is extremely important to make sure that we continue to create institutions as open as possible, as diverse as possible, so that we can change the pattern of voting, for example, for the future.
The ACLU says that they also provide bilingual voter rights information. They also run a hotline for many people who have complaints about their experiences or things like that at the polls or during the process. So again, they have all that on their website, and we'll also have that on a link on our website on KTVB.com.
And is it in Spanish and English?
Yeah, so they basically have all the information, whether it's things to take, any information in terms of what's on your ballot and what information you need. They have it both in English and in Spanish.
Okay, good to know. Hector Mendoza reporting here on Viewpoint. Thank you, Hector. Hey, still ahead for you after the break. We're going to take you up to Clark County, Idaho, where more than 42% of the population identifies as Hispanic. It's there. A federal mandate requires ballots to be printed in a different language than English, Spanish. Plus, the next generation of voters, how young Latinos are working to make their voices heard this election season. If you haven't registered to vote yet, Brenda, we're going to talk about this. There's some good news.
That's right. You can register to vote at the polls on Election Day in Idaho. Here's what you'll need. You'll need some sort of photo ID. That can be an Idaho driver's license or ID card, a passport or federal ID, a tribal ID card, or a concealed weapons license that has been issued by a county sheriff in the state of Idaho. Hey, you'll also need proof of residence. You can see that is on your screen right now. That's things like a utility bill, a bank statement, a credit card statement, proof of insurance, and you can learn more at voteidaho.gov. We'll be right back after this quick break.
As As we mentioned just before the break, there is one county in the state of Idaho which does have Spanish language on their ballots. It's all the way up in Clark County, and they have been federally required to do so since 2021. Our Richard Rodriguez traveled up to Clark County to speak with election officials who say even though they have that resource, it hasn't translated to more Hispanic voters.
In the easternmost part of the state, north of Idaho Falls, is Clark County. Idaho is known for its agriculture, and the quiet town of Du Bois, Idaho, is no different.
It is very rural.
Here in Clark County, things are a little bit different. Federal law requires ballots to have Spanish language printed on them. We spoke to the county clerk who says it's a great resource, but more needs to be done.
Correct. We are the only county required to have it on our ballots.
That's Stephanie Stewart, the county clerk. She says they have the Spanish translation because of the Federal Voting Rights Act.
There's a code that says you have to meet a certain criteria. You have to have either 10,000 people or greater than 5% who are only Spanish speaking.
The code is Section 203 and extends protections to language minorities, including Spanish speakers. Census data reports the county is above that 5%, so Clark County, in 2021, is now required to have Spanish translations. It aims to help eligible voters who only know Spanish vote.
¿Hay muchos hispanos aquí?
Conocidos que vivimos aquí en este pueblo, sí hay algunos hispanos, sí.
Mendoza has lived in Du Bois for over 30 years, and she says she came to the U.S. with her parents at a young age. And she is a dual citizen, which allows her to vote.
Sí puedo votar.
But never has, even though the ballot lists items such as positions, initiatives, and instructions in Spanish.
No, yo no sabía que había palabras en español para cuando uno va a votar.
¿No sabías eso?
No. No es que no había votado, pero este año sí.
Stewart says less than 10% of Spanish-speaking voters in Clark County go to the polls, and having this resource hasn't translated to more votes. But both women believe with more outreach, more Hispanic voters would vote.
Ellos también deben de pasar la información a otras personas para que todos vayamos sabiendo.
For all counties in the state, voters are allowed to bring a translator with them to the polls, but some say it's a Band-Aid to a problem.
I think that there's definitely a population that's underserved in the state. It makes sense to me why we're required to have that on our ballot, but I definitely think there's an opportunity for other counties to step up and have it on their ballot as well.
Stewart told me that if she wasn't representing everyone in her county, she wouldn't be doing her job. She also says the Spanish translation on the ballot ups up costs because it's 4 pages, and it takes more time as they're a hand-count county. In an effort to help Spanish speakers, she has requested the Spanish translation of the Secretary of State's online voter pamphlet. And Joe, she said that she did this because she wants to represent her community.
And my question for you is, comparing Canyon County, closer to us, versus Clark County, why doesn't Canyon County have Spanish on their ballot?
That's a good question, Joe. And the reason why is because they have to meet the federal requirements of 203 of the Federal Voting Rights Act. Basically, if they don't meet that 10%, or if they don't meet that 5%, or over 10,000 voters, exclusively Spanish speaking, then they don't need to have it. So Canyon County didn't reach either of them, so they don't have it.
It'll be interesting to see as that community grows in Canyon County if they do hit that threshold. Richard Rodriguez reporting here on Viewpoint. Thank you so much for your time, Richard. Hispanic voters tend to be younger than other voters overall. That's according to a Pew Research report. Local organizations like Poder of Idaho say here in the Gem State, they are the group becoming more civilly engaged. KTVB's Daisy Batista spoke with first-time young Latino voters to hear about their experiences.
Here in Idaho, young Latinos are enthusiastic and determined to cast their vote in the upcoming election.
I get to give my voice and my input, so that's why I'm excited.
Yeah, more my first time voting, but yeah, I'm really excited.
A voice these 2 Boise State students will soon use for the first time.
I am a first gen, so I will be the first one in my family to be able to vote.
19-year-old Diana Colis and 20-year-old Diego Tapia say it's important to them that they get involved.
I know that my vote isn't just a piece of paper that goes forgotten in thin air.
Really think that sort of the environment that we're in is a very, tense environment. but I think ultimately it's really important that, you know, people get involved.
And when it comes to young Latino voters getting involved, they have strength in numbers. A public policy nonprofit, the Brookings Institution, found that 31% of all Latino eligible voters are between 18 and 29 years old, in comparison to 21% of the entire U.S. population of eligible voters. The Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement also reports 18 to 19-year-olds make up 40% of all newly eligible Latino voters in the West, nearly matching the 42% of youth in that age group who are white.
You know, the younger generation has always been at the forefront in any movement.
Estefania Mondragon is the executive director of Poder of Idaho, a local advocacy group. She says young Idaho Latinos are equally as eager to get out and vote.
It's really young people wanting to, get the message out there of the importance of being civically engaged.
The Idaho Commission on Hispanic Affairs shows people between 20 and 24 years old are the second largest age group in Idaho's growing Hispanic community, meaning many of them are eligible voters. And with the presidential election around the corner, there are specific topics motivating this group to cast their ballot.
What we're seeing an increase of is like social equity. They want to see changes in that, and they want government to have a voice in that, right? Their government to say something and to do something about these social ills.
Social policies for sure. I look for equality, for justice, and acceptance, respect.
Abortion rights, LGBTQ rights. Also, I would place a heavy importance on immigration as well personally.
Mondragon says any change starts with voting.
Whether they're Democrat, Republican, Constitutional, Libertarian, we want y'all to make your voices heard. We just want Latinos to go out and vote.
Deanna and Diego agree.
I would say go vote. It's important. Your vote counts. It's our future.
Don't let anyone tell you how to vote, but I definitely encourage to be a part of the process and to show people the power that you do have, and the collective power that we, whether as Latinos or even just as a greater community, can have on who's representing us and how we can fix the issues of today.
And as I mentioned, ages 20 to 24 years old are the second largest Hispanic group here in Idaho. However, tracking how many of them are actually voting, it's a bit tricky. As Brenda mentioned earlier, Idaho currently does not have an option for voters to identify their ethnicity when registering to vote. And Joe, states such as Alabama and even South Carolina do require voters when registering to write in their ethnicity, making it easier to track data. However, I will say I feel like young Latinos are definitely very excited to vote when going out to the polls here in Idaho.
It'd be interesting to see if the Secretary of State's office or lawmakers would be interested in changing laws so that we could have more data on not just Latinos, but all groups.
Absolutely.
Daisy Batista reporting here on Viewpoint. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Still ahead for you after the break. Besides the national election, what is on your ballot? We're going to sit down with the Secretary of State to get a better look on what you can expect on Election Day. And if you know you're going to be out of town on Election Day or you just want to avoid the polls altogether, we'll tell you how you can vote absentee. Hector, tell us about it.
Well, Joe, you can request your ballot online at voteidaho.gov. You must have your Idaho state issued ID and the last 4 digits of your social security number. It should arrive within 7 to 10 days, so you should fill it out, send it back either through mail or drop it off at a secure ballot drop box, and it must arrive at your county elections office by 8 p.m. on Election Day. We'll be right back.
We've heard from community members and local organizations, but another big question, what's actually going to be on the ballot in November? I spoke with Secretary of State Phil McGrain about what to know.
One of the best places to go is to voteidaho.gov. Voteidaho.gov really is your one-stop shop for voting information. You can look up your voter record, you can view a sample ballot, and I think that's one of the really key things this cycle. For the first time, voters all across the state can look up their information, they can find their polling place and see the actual ballot they'll be voting on, and it really gives voters a chance to digest who the candidates are to make an informed choice. One of the things I want to highlight is, we've really been pushing voteidaho.gov as a resource for everybody, and we truly mean that. One of the things we added this year for the first time is there is now Spanish pages dedicated for voters who don't speak English on Vote Idaho to get the same resources as everybody else does. We do have a couple of counties that will actually be producing Spanish ballots just based on the makeup of the community for this election, and we wanted to make sure they have all the additional resources. So if you visit voteidaho.gov, up in the upper right-hand corner, you can check out all the Spanish resources as well.
What happens if you have questions about something on the ballot while you're voting? Can you ask somebody for help at a polling place?
Yes, if anybody needs help, so let's say you have a family member and you need assistance, doesn't matter who it is, as long as the voter is the one who chooses, they can get assistance from whoever they want. They can also use the election officials for a resource. Now, one of the challenges, the poll workers, they'll help you in terms of if you need to get a new ballot issued or anything else, but they're not going to tell you how to vote on the candidates or races.
Is my ballot public record? Are people going to know who or how I voted?
Oh, great question. In terms of your voting, so we know whether you voted or not, and that information is public to the campaigns, but how you voted, what you marked on your ballot, we have a constitutional right in Idaho to a secret ballot. We take extra precautions to make sure we can never associate a name with a vote. So no one gets to know how Phil McGrain voted, no one gets to know how Joe Paris voted. All that information is protected and intentionally separated. It's part of the security of our voting system to do that, but also just a reassurance that we want to make sure voters can vote their conscience, and that's part of the thing that we protect in this process.
What message would you have to communities that are kind of activating into this and deciding, maybe I'll vote, maybe I won't? What's the value in voting here in the state of Idaho?
Oh, there are so many important races to watch that we'll be voting on, and I've been a part of so many really, really close races. In 2020, we had a race here locally that was 2 votes apart out of 40,000 ballots cast. Just during the last primary, we did a recount that was 2 votes apart for the legislature. You never know which races are going to be close, and so if you want to help determine the course of the community, what's going on in our state, whether that's repairing the roads, whether that's how we're managing our schools, or how we're going to run our elections in the future, this is a really great opportunity to have a voice in that entire process.
And we've got several voter resources if you're looking for more information. And Brenda, I'm curious, what resources are available?
Yes, well, we've talked about the Hispanic community and Spanish speakers, including Contamos Idaho. The ACLU will have a voter line that you can call on Election Day, and it will also be in Spanish, and as well as voteidaho.gov, which is also available in Spanish.
And there's a couple of dates to keep in mind. Early voting begins in most counties on October 21st and runs through November 1st, and you can check with your county to find locations and times. If you're planning to request an absentee ballot, you must do that before October 25th, and it must be in the hands of the election office by 8 p.m. on Election Day, which is Tuesday, November 5th.
And I just want to add something to the Secretary of State Phil McGrain mentioned. It's okay to ask questions. And I think there are some times where voters from a lot of different communities feel nervous or unsure about being a part of the process. The process is for everyone. It's a democracy here in the United States. So if you have questions, they will tell you who to vote for. But if you have questions at the polling location, it's okay to ask. And again, take someone with you.
Yeah, and I will just quickly add, for those families that do have Spanish speakers at home, we do have all this content over on our website in Spanish, ktvb.com/espanol.
And by taking somebody with you, you can also take somebody that speaks Spanish so they can translate the stuff for you. So that's another good resource too for many people out there that don't have maybe the dominant English as their first language.
Well, I want to thank Daisy Bautista, Richard Rodriguez, Hector, and Brenda for helping to put this special together. This has been Viewpoint. Thank you so much. If you ever have questions, feel free to send us an email. That's all we got for you this week. We'll see you next time here on Viewpoint.